U.S. President Barack Obama has unveiled a defense strategy to expand the country's military presence in the Asia-Pacific region amid defense cuts. Xu Wenjing has more on this story.
It is a time of transition for the world's largest military power. To cope with budget cuts and transitional national security interests, the U.S. government is reducing spending in Europe and moving its military resources further east.
We will be strengthening our presence in the Asia-Pacific, and budget reductions will not come at the expense of that critical region.
The President's strategic review will reset defense priorities and guide defense budget cuts over the next decade. Despite the good relationship China and the U.S. hold, the review indicates the U.S. is too worried about the strategic intention of China's military buildup and thinks its rise could affect U.S. economy and security.
The Chinese are in a massive military buildup. Last year, they increased their defense spending by over 12%. In the next decade, while we decline, our defense spending declines and our forces shrink, that 12% multiplied will give them a tripling of their defense budget. Since they don't have to worry about other theaters, that means essentially they're now going to be a peer competitor.
The new strategy also seeks to improve U.S. capabilities in areas such as cyber warfare and missile defense. The detailed plan won't be available for several weeks. Xu Wenjing, CCTV.
Not satisfied with its missile shield in Europe, Washington has announced plans for a similar weapon system in Asia. A Pentagon official pointed at a perceived threat from North Korea as the main justification. But political activist and head of the new Patriotic Alliance, Renata Reyes, says that's a paper-thin excuse.
Clearly, the threat is being exaggerated by the United States, but we can see beyond the rhetoric that the real target here is China, and the U.S. wants to justify rebalancing most of its troops towards the Asian region. The so-called threats emanating from China are highly suspicious, questionable, and are in fact being twisted just so the U.S. can justify sending more troops and ships here in this region. Only intended to provide more justification for the permanent and expanded U.S. military presence in our region. That's another concern of ours. Will the U.S. missile shield provoke an arms race in the region? Would it provoke countries like China and North Korea into taking a tougher stance, into competing with the United States and deploying more war machines throughout Asia? And if that happens, that would be a bigger threat to peace.
I'm Deborah Kahn. Joining me now is Paul Burton, who is Asia Pacific Director at IHS Aerospace and Defense. Joining me now from Singapore. Okay, hi Paul. So obviously the U.S. bombers were able to fly in this area without incident, but in your opinion, how dangerous can the situation get?
Absolutely. Well, I think you have to view China's creation of this ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone, on the backdrop of recent history, which really has seen an escalation of the tension in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, with all the major states surrounding it having competing claims to a number of islands there that they believe to be rich in natural resources. And I think that the United States response to China's creation of this ADIZ was probably unexpected in Beijing, and has certainly assisted in creating this tension that is now really taking root in this region.
Okay, so is it necessary for the U.S. to really take on the role of policing this region in support of Japan?
Yeah, I mean, U.S. has a long-standing agreement with Japan to de facto protect its territorial integrity from security threats. And I think one can view recent moves by the United States flying the B-52s from Guam over the ADIZ as part of that strategy. Whether or not the US views itself as a regional policeman, I think is open to interpretation. I think from Washington's perspective, they would say, look, all we're doing here is standing by our key ally in the region. Obviously, from Beijing's perspective, they can say, well, look, we have a national right to defend our airspace and our territorial integrity. And guess what? Japan has an ADIZ, South Korea, a lot of the surrounding states have these zones. Therefore, all we're doing is saying we have a right to create our own zone, and does the US then have a kind of a counter right, if you like, to fly in and out of it at will? Beijing will say no, Washington yes, and therefore we reach another kind of diplomatic impasse, if you like.
Okay, and this has been a long-standing dispute over the islands known as Senkaku in Japan and Diaoyu in China. So China does appear to be becoming aggressive, a lot more aggressive lately. What would you expect next?
Well, I think we can see a continuation of this tit-for-tat exchange, if you like, between the various actors in the region. The IHS covers a global defence budget, and that's a key indicator, really, of how you can expect to see trends developing in the region. We're seeing budgets in Western Europe and America fall. We're seeing budgets in Asia Pacific rise. So we forecast between now and the end of the decade, Japan will spend around $400 billion on defence budgets, China around 975 billion, South Korea 300 billion. We're seeing a picture here of a region that is becoming increasingly militarized. China is developing increasing UAV capability, for example, that concerns the region. Japan is responding in kind, and it all just kind of develops a sense of uncertainty and insecurity in a region that is obviously pumping a lot of its cash into defence budgets and procurement. I think what prevents this from escalating to a kind of a classic military conflict is the depth of trade that you see between China and Japan. And although it's fallen this year by around 8 to 10%, it's still a significant amount, around 175, 180 billion US dollars. And I think that acts as a kind of a tacit guarantor that this doesn't escalate into more traditional warfare.
Okay, I know a lot of people in the region are certainly hoping so. So thanks very much. Paul Burton joining us from Singapore. For more on this story, you could go to WSJ.com. I'm Deborah Kahn.
China plans to use unmanned drones to increase its presence around the islands that are at the center of a volatile dispute with Japan. They will conduct marine surveillance of the area. 3 Chinese patrol vessels still remain very close to the uninhabited but strategic archipelago and have briefly entered waters which Japan considers its territory. The conflict's seen large-scale protests in both countries turn ugly. The row could be further complicated as Taiwanese boats are now heading to the islands to reassert their fishing rights in the area, while all around the U.S. is increasing its military activity in the region. For an expert's opinion on the story, I'm now joined live by James Corbett, editor of the Corbett Report website from Japan. Thank you, James, for joining us today. Now tell us, why is there so much deep-rooted interest in these tiny, uninhabited islands?
Well, ostensibly, this is about the potential oil and gas reserves that have been estimated to be in that area. So this is what the geopolitical calculus is about. But I think we have to understand this entire dispute not in terms of the islands themselves, which most average Japanese and average Chinese people, I think, don't really care about. I think this is being played up as a nationalist sentiment and nationalist fervor. And there's a couple of reasons for this. I think one of them is the political calculus that both countries are making right now. In fact, China is going through its once every 10 years leadership change. So we'll see Hu Jintao replaced by Xi Jinping later this year. And Japan was also going through an election cycle of sorts here, with the ruling Democratic Party of Japan having an internal leadership election. And I think both sides of that dispute, just like in any election cycle in the US or Russia or anywhere else in the world, the leaders like to play up their international prestige and talk tough to a perceived enemy or threat. during an election season or cycle, and I think that's part of what's been going on here. And I think also this the entire conflict gives both sides room to put out more of their pieces on the chessboard, as it were, so that China, for example, can use this as a cover to announce the deployment of drones in 2015, and Japan can use this as a chance to increase their military ties with the U.S.
Now, there's a third party that's also directly involved in the island row, and that's Taiwan. Where is it all heading? Will other countries get dragged in as well?
It is potentially, I suppose it is possible, depending on how this unfolds. And I think part of the underlying political calculus is that both sides wants this to be a big dispute in diplomatic terms, but I don't think either side is really looking for military confrontation at this point. So I think that would be a break on any sort of larger development going on here. But having said that, I think if there was to be one side that overacted, I think the other side would be more likely to overreact because of this kind of tense time that's going on politically. So it has the potential to get bigger. And right now, Australia is being proposed as a third party to arbitrate in a trilateral security talk between Canberra, Beijing, and Tokyo over this dispute. So we'll see if it does broaden out into the region. But right now, Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihiko Noda is in New York to attend the UN General Assembly meeting, and he will likely raise this dispute while he's there. So this is becoming a bit of an international issue.
Now, James, very briefly, I do want to delve a little more into Taiwan. Do you think the conflict will trigger a surge in separatist sentiment there?
I suppose there's that possibility, and in a strange way it almost unites it with China in that they're both disputing Japan's claims. So I suppose it has the potential to go either way, and I wouldn't pronounce on the Taiwanese position on this, but I think that certainly at this moment both sides see Japan as the enemy more than they see each other as the enemy. So I think there might be strategic alliances, etc., but in terms of really changing the balance of power in that relationship, I don't think it will have a huge effect in and of itself.
All right, and finally, the protests in China could certainly cost Japanese businesses billions of dollars. How will the dispute play out for the country's economies?
Well, that's, I think, part of this this calculus, the political calculus that's going on. I think there's also an economic price to pay for this because, of course, it destabilizes markets and it creates volatility. We see the Japanese market declining on this dispute as well as the rising yen. So I think that both sides have an interest in not seeing this spill over into too large a confrontation. They want to keep the political rhetoric up, but I don't think they want it to really destabilize the markets too much. So I think that also puts a brake on it, and we have seen in recent days Beijing starting to crack down on some of these protests that were getting quite widespread. So I think that the brakes are being applied, but we'll have to again see how this plays out and make sure that if one side reacts, there could be a potential for much more violence in the region.
And what about Washington's position in all of this? I mean, they've made it very clear that it will be on Tokyo's side in case of further escalation of the dispute. How do you expect China will respond to that?
Well, as expected, that can only raise tensions in the area, but I think that's all part of the long-term strategy as we see the U.S. starting its Asia-Pacific pivot. So I think it actually has an interest in increasing tensions between Japan and China because that makes Japan ever more eager to accept the American military presence, which up until now there's been quite strong protests against, but now we see them renewing joint military exercises in Guam, etc. So it is increasing the Japanese reliance on the American security blanket, as it were, and I think that plays into American interests. So I think they actually probably benefit from this dispute.
All right, live from Japan with his insight and analysis, James Corbett, editor of the Corbett Report website. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely, Andrew. U.S. Vice President Joe Biden has certainly walked into a real hotbed here in the Asia-Pacific region. As you say, he arrived here in Tokyo late last night, met by the new U.S. ambassador to Japan, Caroline Kennedy. She's been in the job now for all of 3 weeks. Mr. Biden will be meeting with Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe a little bit later today. And as you say, his visit really will be overshadowed by these tensions between China and Japan over China's newly declared air identification defense zone, air defense identification zone, I should say. So really, he is here to perhaps lower tensions. That's what we're hearing from his officials, but also, as you mentioned, seek clarification as for China's new defence zone, what it has declared, certainly the United States sees it as a rather provocative act, which is why it sent two US B-52 bombers, unarmed B-52 bombers, over that area last week, and China responded by scrambling jets. Andrew.
Anna, is there a sense that the Vice President can actually sort of untangle this development? I mean, does he have the power to try to diffuse the situation? He is going to be going to China to speak with the Chinese, but is he a deal maker that Japan hopes can change the status quo?
Look, I think Japan certainly sees the United States as an ally, and obviously Joe Biden's visit shores up that partnership. I think his visit is also about really positioning America here in the Asia-Pacific region. We hear about this Asia pivot and America rebalancing its foreign policy, and obviously it wants to counter the rise of China militarily and economically. We've seen that over the last couple of years, China really developing into this superpower, and America really wants to, I guess, put its stamp back on the region. So Joe Biden's visit, like this was planned, well in advance of these recent tensions between China and Japan. It is very much about putting America's stamp here on the Asia-Pacific region, Andrew.
Okay.
Beijing's declaration of an air defense identification zone over disputed waters in the East China Sea has sparked a heated row. The imposition of new rules, which include the airspace over islands in dispute with Japan, is being seen by Tokyo as an escalation.
China creating this sort of zone and forcing others to abide by it changes the situation in the East China Sea and escalates it in a way that could cause an unpredictable and dangerous situation.
As Chinese broadcaster CCTV showed footage of a recent drill, the Defense Ministry said it had protested to the Japanese and US embassies about their criticism of the new zone. Beijing's warning of defensive emergency measures against aircraft which fail to identify themselves properly.
To a show of military force in Asia now, China has sent warplanes to the area it declared an air defense zone earlier this week. It follows a call by Beijing for regional powers to ask permission before carrying out operations there. But the zone includes territory claimed by both South Korea and Japan, and they, along with the United States, have been flying military aircraft through the area. Hala Mohieddin has more.
China on a charm offensive. A spokesman for the Defence Ministry set about clarifying the new controversial air defence identification zone, attempting to reassure neighbours, saying they only want the right to identify aircraft entering the zone.
The establishment of an air defence identification zone does not mean we're expanding the existing territorial airspace. It merely ensures more effective protection of our country's airspace.
However, despite the softer tone, they're not prepared to U-turn on the issue and continued demands for aircraft to comply with the new policy.
We hope that relevant countries' airlines can proactively cooperate so there is more order and safety for flights.
China's neighbours are not appeased, and Japan has maintained that they will continue routine flights through the zone.
We have absolutely no intention of changing our plans just because of China.
The Japanese government has asked airlines to disregard China's air defense zone rules, and both ANA and Japan Airlines have confirmed they will stop filing flight plans demanded by China on all routes through the zone. The Japanese and South Korean military have confirmed that they too have flown through the disputed airspace following the test flight by two US B-52s on Tuesday. China, however, remains unmoved. On Thursday, they rejected South Korea's demand for the repeal of the zone and have maintained its legitimacy. The zone's establishment fuels fears of further aggressive moves to assert China's territorial claims, especially in the hotly disputed South China Sea.
We're learning that China's only aircraft carrier is on the move after a direct challenge by the United States. Two U.S. warplanes flew over the East China Sea in a disputed area that China is claiming as an air defense zone. Beijing also is involved in territorial disputes in the South China Sea, where that aircraft carrier is heading. Let's bring in our CNN Pentagon correspondent, Barbara Starr. Barbara, this sounds serious. What's going on here?
Well, Jim, China certainly flexing its muscle with its military and its Navy. It was over the weekend that the Chinese declared this air exclusion zone and said any military flights entering it had to file flight plans and declare their intentions with Beijing. The U.S. said, no, thank you, we won't be doing that because it's international airspace by U.S. rules. So let's take a look at what really happened on Monday. 2 B-52 aircraft flew their flight path from Guam, their home base, and flew to the East China Sea. They flew right through the air zone. They did not declare a flight plan or any of their intentions, then spent about an hour in that region, turned around and flew back to Guam without incident. The U.S. says it was a training mission and that they do this all the time, and they see no reason to obey these new, what they view, Chinese demands. Both sides talked about it over the weekend, the U.S. pressing the Chinese, even with this disagreement with Japan over the territories, over the islands in the region, not to cause more problems in this very, very sensitive area.